So hello and welcome to another episode of Geographics. I'm your interim host, Karl Smallwood, and today we're talking about Sybaris, Thurii, Copia, Empire, Hubris, and Decadence way before Rome. And this video is based on an original article by Arnoldo Teodrani, and I would like to point out that there are a lot of Greek and Italian words coming up throughout this video. I have endeavoured to discover the correct pronunciation with pronunciation guides online and the like, but they're not always perfect, and I'm not a public speaker by trade, but I'm trying my best. So let's get to it. In today's Geographics, we're going to explore the history of an ancient Italian city that grew out of obscurity into an economic and military powerhouse, annexed by its neighbours and became one of the most populous and spectacularly rich cities in all of antiquity. When Italy and antiquity are used in the same breath, it's easy to think about Rome. Well, think again. When Rome was still little more than a village, Greek colonies flourished in southern Italy, founding rich and powerful city-states. Such was the success of these polities that the region became known as Magna Graecia, or Great Greece. Mega Greece was right there. Follow the Nintendo path. Nintendo Entertainment System, Super Nintendo Entertainment System, Greece, Super Greece. Between the 8th and 6th centuries BC, one of these cities emerged as the preeminent power of the region, one whose name will become a synonym for luxury and decadent self-indulgence. But the harvest of success also brought the kernel of its demise, an almost complete and total oblivion. Welcome to Sybaris. Sybaris was located in the modern-day region of Calabria, the tip of the Italian boot, more precisely the coast facing the Ionian Sea. In the year 720 BC, the coast was visited by an expedition of Asian colonists. The Asians were Greeks of Doric descent, hailing from the Peloponnesus. I told you there was a lot of Greek and Italian words in this one. And the leader, or oikistis, of their party was Is of Haliki, who picked a perfect spot to found their new settlement, a fertile valley bordered by the mouths of two rivers, the Krathis and the Sybaris, the latter being chosen as the name of this new city. The area was settled by the Asian colonists who were blessed by mild weather, rich soil, and natural protection offered by the two rivers and the Pelino Range to the north. Not much is known about the development of Sybaris in the ensuing decades, but it's safe to say that the Sybarites did pretty well for themselves, becoming the richest and most important polis in Magna Graecia of the 6th century. The economy of Sybaris similarly flourished on three pillars: agriculture, exploitation of natural resources, and trade. The area was naturally favourable to farming, and the colonists showed nature who was boss by digging a complex network of canals to fully exploit the rivers of the Krathis and Sybaris. Their irrigation system ensured plentiful crops all year round. The ingenious Sybarites also sought to exploit the local resources to their fullest potential. For example, the Scylla plain to the south of the polis was lush with conifer woods, which provided plenty of timber and resin, again, year-round, deciduous trees. It looks like the Sybarites had struck metaphorical gold, and later they struck literal silver by prospecting and digging mines for the precious ore further inland. The pockets of Sybaris were deep and full. This allowed the city rulers to fund the construction of a fluvial port, noted as being the safest harbour on the Ionian coast. This attracted a particular clientele, ships in need of repairs and refitting, and with ships there came trade, and with trade, further wealth, and with more wealth, the Greek colonists looking to strike it big. By the early 6th century BC, Sybaris occupied a surface of 50 stadia, equivalent to an area of about 500 hectares. For our American friends, that is equivalent to 934 football fields. Why do you measure everything in football fields? That's the thing, in my head I can't picture how big a football field is. Is it just like that mental math that Americans can do? And its urban population peaked at around 300,000, approximately 10% the entire population of the Italian peninsula at the time. Rome would only reach such a population level some 5 centuries later. Now, we don't know exactly the system of government in Sybaris. A passage by historian Diodorus Siculus mentions that a leader of the people persuaded by the Sybarites. Ancient rhetorician Athanasius even mentions that the great philosopher Aristotle had written a constitution of Sybaris, though this is not survived to this day. From these hints, we can infer that Sybaris was ruled as a democracy which acted in the best interests of its own citizens with little regard for neighbouring cities or the pre-existing inhabitants of the area. Modern-day Calabria, in fact, had been home to the Entranians before the arrival of the Greeks. Their villages and their culture may not have been as sophisticated as the Greek settlements, but they were flourishing nonetheless. This is until more colonists flocked to Sybaris. As they settled in the polis, the government assigned them plots of land in the surrounding countryside. And when that land was not readily available, no problem, they could just steal it from the Entranians. The locals were thus pushed further inland or were forced to move to the big city, taking on menial jobs just to survive. The Sybarites were no kinder to other people in the area, not even to their fellow Greeks who had founded other competing cities. Ancient historian Strabo noted how Sybaris controlled through conquest, foundation, or skillful alliances, a total of 4 families and 25 cities. Sybaris had first projected its influence by founding 4 new colonies: Metaponto on the Ionian coast, Poseidonia, Laos, and Skidrow on the Tyrrhenian coast. This ensured its southern rearguard was secured before moving northwards to crush the competing colony of Syris and annex its fertile lands. By the second half of the 6th century, Sybaris had extended its grip over a territory roughly equal to half of modern-day Calabria, covering an area of some 7,000 square kilometres, about 50% of Connecticut. I don't know what that is in football fields. Is Connecticut not measured in football fields? This may not appear impressive by today's standards, but you have to take into account the context of the Hellenic world at the time. None of the other city-states in Greece or Italy had experienced such a rapid expansion at that point. But what really set Sybaris apart was the luxury enjoyed by its many, many inhabitants. In the English language, the word sybarite came to define a self-indulgent and luxurious lifestyle. It's also a word I've never heard, so that's news to me too. According to Athenaeus, the inhabitants of the polis were so indolent that they forbid any noisy trade be carried out in their city, lest it disturb their chilling time. The same author also recounts how the Sybarites would dedicate an entire year to the preparation of a single magnificent banquet. These feasts must have been truly legendary to have taken that long to set up, and a common form of entertainment at them was to watch trained horses dancing to the tune of a flute, which admittedly does sound entertaining. So I don't really like dressage at the Olympics, but I do enjoy watching the horses do the teeny tiny part of thing. Athenaeus was clearly not a friend of a city, which he depicted as resting on its laurels under the blanket of hubris and complacency. But as they enjoyed the melodies of their flutes and the pitter-patter of the tiny horse feet, the Sybarites failed to notice the approaching sound of marching drums signalling the end. Some of the harshest critics of the Sybaris way of life could be found among its most erstwhile ally, the city of Croton. The polis at the time was ruled by an oligarchy, a system of government in which a small number of aristocratic families held power. Most of Croton's oligarchs had been trained at the school of philosopher Pythagoras. Yes, the guy who did Pythagoras' theorem. Besides triangles, Pythagoras had a great interest in morals, and he did not appreciate one bit the decadent lifestyle of the Sybarites. As a consequence, most of Crotone's rulers were openly hostile to Sybaris. There may have been a little hypocrisy at play here. It seems like the Crotonians despised the wealth of the Sybarites, but they also aspired to expand northwards and take control of their rich and affluent trade networks. In 520 BC, the chilliest city in Mega Greece was shaken by internal turmoil. A tyrant named Tellus had rallied a faction of aristocrats and launched a coup, overthrowing democracy. According to Diodorus Siculus, Tellus had convinced the Sybarites to exile some 500 members of the city elites and confiscate all of their properties. Yeah, down with the bourgeoisie. Understandably, these exiles were not happy and fled to Croton, asking for help there. There, the Pythagorean oligarchs welcomed them with open triangles. You can't do that. You can't say open triangles and expect me to say that with a straight face. At this point, Tellus sent the Crotonians an ultimatum: return those rich exiles to us or expect war. On Pythagoras' suggestion, Croton decided to protect the 500 and prepare for battle, and a gigantic one at that. The numbers are probably exaggerated, but according to some ancient sources, around 100,000 Crotonians and 300,000 Sybarites met on the river Trianta, which marks the border between their territories. According to ancient historian Herodotus, the Crotonians had a special asset in their camp: Calais the diviner. The priest was initially an acolyte of Tellus, the Sybaritic tyrant. At the start of the war, Calais had performed ritual sacrifices to gain the favour of the gods against Croton. As he failed to obtain favourable omens, Tellus had expelled him, thus pushing him into the arms of the enemy. We'll leave it to your imagination whether or not having the help of a powerful diviner was a strategic advantage or not. According to Diodorus Siculus, their greatest asset, though, was their commander, Milo the athlete. And I'm aware of Milo of Croton because I wrote an article and presented a video on him for my channel Fact Things, so you can see more information about Milo of Croton, specifically how he died, which was fighting wolves with his thighs. But we have a quote about Milo of Croton here, where they simply say that he came to battle wearing his Olympic crowns and equipped with the gear of Heracles, a lion's skin and a club. And that's all he wore. And Milo of Croton reportedly just strode across the battlefield, crushing people with that club. And he stood some 8 feet tall, according to historical accounts, and was physically strong enough to lift and kill a fully grown adult bull with a wrestling hold. They also said of his prodigious strength, by reason of his great strength, he was the first to put fight into his adversaries. As interesting as the idea of a Crotonian hero unit sounds, they most likely employed the typical tactics of the era. They fielded units of hoplites or spearmen, tightly packed into one or more phalanxes around 8 men deep. These phalanxes, whose sides were guarded by either light horsemen or missile troops, charged head-on into their enemies, presumably deployed in a similar fashion. Unless a general on either side came up with a brilliant stratagem, battles resulted in giant shoving matches until one side broke and fled. I'm guessing the side with the 8-foot-tall Olympian who could powerbomb bulls, that their pushing was probably a little stronger. Historians love to document brilliant stratagems, and the fact that no stroke of genius is reported about this battle, we can assume that the Crotonians simply shoved harder than the Sybarites. Tellis's army, in fact, broke their ranks and fled back to Sybaris. The invading army then besieged the wealthy polis, which eventually surrendered. In antiquity, it was customary for the victorious besiegers to plunder the defeated cities and sell the population into slavery. But the Crotonians went just a little bit further. Their potential for dickery, shall we say, was just altogether higher. So, first they razed Sybaris to the ground, which admittedly was not unheard of. Then they went a step further than that. They deviated the course of the river Crathis so that these waters flooded the ruins of Sybaris, erasing the city from existence. Athenius thus captured the ignominious end of the hubristic polis, stating, and I quote, hopefully verbatim, "You shall be happy, Sybarite, very happy, and all of your time in entertainments pass. Then foreign war and intestine sedition shall come upon you and shall crush your city." Now, the story of Sybaris could and maybe should have ended here, and we could all go grab a coffee or take a nap. But the absolute nerd of author who wrote this one insisted that the story of the Sybarites was not over yet, so let's continue. So Croton had wiped out Sybaris and gained control over its empire in Calabria. The Sybaritic territories were almost twice as vast as the area originally controlled by Croton, which made it next to impossible for the Crotonists to exert a stable and effective rule. Thus, many Sybarites escaped the heel of the occupiers and resettled in the old colonies of Laos and Poseidonia. That is such a cool name for a city! Oh man, I love that Muse song. From there, they never abandoned their dream of rebuilding their beloved city in the future. But they needed support, funds, manpower, all that good stuff. And who could they ask for help? The other cities in southern Italy? No, they didn't get on well. So they thought, well, we lorded over the tip of the boot for so long, we've pissed off everybody here. Why not go back to the source, their motherland, Greece? So for decades, Laos and Poseidonia dispatched requests for help from the major city-states in the Peloponnesus, from whence their Asian ancestors had once come. In 453 BC, the area once occupied by Sybaris was settled again by Greek colonists. However, these hail from Thessaly and not the Peloponnesus. The descendants of the Sybarites wanted the real deal, so they once again sent an even more insistent request to the motherland, which were finally answered in 444 BC. That's when Athenian statesman Pericles was about to launch an expansionist policy, and the Sybaritic call for help arrived at pretty much the exact right time. Pericles organised a large expedition with the aim of founding a new colony on the site where Sybaris had once thrived. In 443 BC, the Oikistis Lampo and Xenocrates sailed ahead of the mission. And this mission actually included several celebrities of the era. Names you may recognise include the philosopher Protagoras, historian Herodotus, the Spartan general Cleonidridas, and the architect Hippodamus of Mileto. Not exactly the Beyonce, is it? But they were of their time. Now, you may have expected this new colony to be named New Sybaris, or if you want it even cooler, Neo Sybaris, or simply Sybaris, but the Athenians' landing party opted for a completely new name, Thurii, after the name of a local spring. But the new settlement was built slap bang where Sybaris had once been, although it never reached its original size, influence, or wealth. What this new city may have lacked in size, it more than compensated for in quality. Architect Hippodamus directed the building works following a rational, well-delineated plan. Hippodamus laid down a grid of main streets which intersected each other at right angles, creating a checkerboard pattern of rectangular blocks, which would be, familiar to Americans, measuring exactly 37 by 74 meters. These blocks were further subdivided by narrow alleyways into perfect squares of 37 by 37 meters. It would be fair to expect that the Sybarites must have been delighted with the outcome of this new Athenian expansion. It appears instead that they were a bunch of ungrateful The Athenian authorities started assigning land to the recently arrived colonists. The Sybarites demanded the best plots and those closest to the city centre. So the Athenians had sailed hundreds of kilometres and footed an astronomical bill, and now they had to contend with a bunch of entitled brats who wanted a short commute. Their understandable response was to kick them out and keep the city for themselves. As for the Sybarites, they relocated on the Trente River, ironically not far from where their ancestors had been soundly defeated by Croton. There they founded New Sybaris. And while Thurii was the authorised sequel to the quite successful original, this second Sybaris was more of a fan fiction spin-off nobody really asked for. Nothing else is really known about New Sybaris except for its name and a vague location, and to the point where modern-day archaeologists have yet to even find its ruins. Now you may be wondering where the rival franchise was in all of this, Croton. And we mentioned earlier, after their sudden expansion in 510 BC, the Crotonians had a hard time administrating their empire, which had been progressively melting away. When the Athenians landed in 443 BC, they had quickly filled a power vacuum, seizing the territories that the Crotonians could not hold control over. In the decades following its foundation, Thurii resumed the expansionist policies of its predecessor city. The polis set its sights on Syria and its territories once annexed by Sybaris, but they had a powerful opponent, the Spartan-founded Tarentum. The Spartan legacy may have made Tarentum a formidable opponent, but the Thurians also had the spirit of Sparta on their side, in the person of General Cleomedridas. The two factions were roughly evenly matched, and their conflict ended in 433 BC, with the Thurii and Tarentum co-founding a new city, Heraclea, in the contested territory. Thurii faced its next greatest threat in the early decades of the 4th century. These were the Lusanians, the hostile people threatening all of Mega Greece. The Hellenic cities formed a defensive alliance, but the Thurians were too impatient. They assembled an army of some 15,000 men and marched against the Lusanians, repulsing their attack. The Thurians pressed the offensive, chasing their enemies into their own lands. The rash decision spelled their doom, and they lost 10,000 soldiers in the very next battle. The defeat against the Lusanians signalled the beginning of a long period of decline for the former Athenian powerhouse, accelerated by the rise of competing powers, first the Bruttians and then, at last, the Romans. By the late 3rd century BC, Thurii was one of many client city-states of Rome, its influence a pale ghost of its once prosperous past. It was at this stage that the city was embroiled in the most devastating conflict to take place in Italy to that day, the Second Punic War. After the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca soundly defeated the Romans at Cannae in 212 BC, Thurii pledged allegiance to the invaders. It may have appeared as the winning bet at the time, but eventually Hannibal had to abandon the Italian peninsula to defend his home city of Carthage. Before leaving, he allowed his troops to plunder Thurii, plunging it further into despair. Some years after the end of the war with Carthage, the Roman Senate considered repopulating the Ionian coast, as the land showed great agricultural potential. Thus, in 194 BC, Rome founded a new colony in the area and decided to do so on the site of the formerly occupied Sybaris and then Thurii. Perhaps in homage to the memory of Sybarite wealth, the new city was named Copia, after the goddess of wealth, harvest and abundance in the Roman pantheon. A total of 3,300 families were sent from Rome to colonize the area, and they mingled with an unknown but surely larger number of locals. Respectable numbers sure, but nowhere near the size of Sybaris' population at its peak. Abiding by the law of diminishing returns, this third instalment in the saga was only about 1/4 the size of Thurii, itself about 1/3 of Sybaris. Nonetheless, Copia was a relatively successful and wealthy urban centre, which reached its peak in the last decades of the 1st century BC. By then, Roman polymath Cicero described it as a pleasant provincial centre, blessed by a well-tended farmland and one of the few functioning ports on the Ionian Sea. But it was a provincial centre after all, far removed from the large cities which designed the destiny of nations. As such, Copia was largely forgotten by chroniclers of the age. We can only assume that Copia paralleled the march of the Western Roman Empire, falling into progressive decline. It's not known if the settlement once known as Sybaris, then Thurii, then Copia, suffered sieges or invasions from the so-called Barbar kingdoms, but we do know that it succumbed to a far more insidious threat, seemingly Poseidon himself. We say this because the shoreline from the mouth of the river Crathis progressed inland, thus rendering the area swampy and infested with mosquitoes. Crop failure and malaria soon followed. By the end of the 7th century AD, the entire area had been abandoned. The ruins of Copia and Thurii were left alone, abandoned like the rotting bones of some ancient monster, slowly sinking into the marshy waters. As time wore on, even those ancient columns and walls would mostly disappear, pillaged by the inhabitants of the surrounding cities looking for cheap building materials, which was far more common in ancient times than you'd expect. For example, it's known that a lot of houses near the Great Wall of China are built with pieces of the Great Wall. In the late 19th century, scholarship discovered a newfound interest in the fate of Sybaris. After decades of investigations, archaeologists identified the original site of the city in early 1930s. Systematic digs, however, only kicked off in 1967. Researchers have successfully excavated an area of about 6 hectares, bringing to light mainly structures belonging to the city of Copia and the harbour during the Thurii phase. The structures which once belonged to the original Sybaris, however, have only been partially discovered. Most of the ruins, which belong to one of the richest cities in the entire Mediterranean, may never be found, lost forever to the marshes of history. So thank you for tuning into this episode of Geographics. As mentioned in the intro, I've been your interim host, Karl Smallwood. This video is based on an original article by Radu Alexander, who made me laugh my arse off camera by referring to triangles unexpectedly. If you'd like to see more of any of our work, you can do so by following the links below. I also host the sister channels to Geographics, Biographics and Top 10s, again, links somewhere, as well as hosting my own channels, Fact Fiend and Wiki Weekends. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like. If you've got something to say about it, leave a comment. And if you want to see more like this, subscribe. Otherwise, I hope that everybody watching at least learned something from this video. And as always, that you all have the day you deserve. Oh no, there's a fly in my water. Cheers.